Before we jump into things, I want to give a disclaimer, especially for those of you who may be watching who are Ben Shapiro fans. At no point in this video am I going to argue that reality is relative, or that there's no such thing as truth, or that facts don't exist. And I'm not even here to argue that Ben is wrong about everything. I don't believe that he is. I'm not going to fall into that postmodern neo-Marxist college professor stereotype. That is not what I'm doing here. I am not a philosopher, I am an English teacher. I don't study metaphysics or ethics, I study words and how people use words. I teach people how to write, how to do research, how to frame that research in a way that makes sense and is intellectually honest. And that is what I'm going to be doing here today. I'm going to be looking at a particular set of words, and I'm going to figure out what they mean, and I'm going to analyze them for accuracy and intellectual honesty. That is my goal. And with that lengthy disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Ben Shapiro is apparently the cool kids philosopher, and while I don't actually know any cool kids who listen to him, he does have a huge platform and a lot of people who support him. Ben has become famous for his catchphrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings." He even published a book under that title. And this statement is now the battle cry of the intellectual dark web, the group of brave academic outsiders who value logic, rationality, and free speech above all else. They believe that mankind can only prosper if we unchain the marketplace of ideas from the regulations of censorship and political correctness. On the surface, this sounds great. I mean, rationality and facts are important, and we should use science to guide our laws and policies instead of just doing things out of fear or because they feel right, right? Well, things are rarely that simple. Now, this video isn't going to be me dunking on Ben Shapiro or Jordan B. Peterson or Sam Harris or any of the other intellectual dark web guys. More talented people than me have already done that. Instead, I want to take a look at the guiding philosophy of the intellectual dark web, this facts don't care about your feelings thing. And I want to analyze this obsession over objectivity, this reverence for rationality and their fixation on facts. And, ultimately, I want to show that facts do, in fact, care about your feelings. Let's get started. I want to take you back about 300 years to the period of time in European history known as the Enlightenment. This was the age of scientific breakthroughs in physics and biology. It was the time of great philosophical minds like Kant and Hume and Rousseau and Locke. It was a time when men valued science and logic and reasoning over the irrational, emotional allure of religion and superstition. They trusted observations and the scientific method to find the truths about our world. In other words, they believed that there were objective facts and that those facts were true whether we felt anything about them. Now, clearly, things have changed a lot over the past 300 years, but a lot of our modern cool philosophers base their worldview on these Enlightenment values. They argue that there are truths that have been discovered by scientists, and that a lot of folks on the left are simply ignoring those truths because they hurt their feelings. This happens with things like climate change and trans issues and policing. The climate is not changing, or at least not due to human intervention, but activists feel like the climate is changing, so it must be. Being trans is a denial of basic biology, but trans people feel they are a certain way, so we're told we have to respect that. Our policing systems in the US aren't racist, but Black Lives Matter folks feel like they are, so I guess they must be. Facts be damned. Dark web intellectuals like Shapiro see themselves as the torchbearers for truth. Facts are being overwhelmed by feelings, and they are the only people who are brave enough to stand up for the hard facts. Facts that are uncomfortable and might show us things that our feelings don't like that there's a difference in IQ between sexes and races. And it's easy to see why this view is so attractive. You have the data on your side. You're just being objective. Yeah, the answers aren't always politically correct, but that's a small price to pay for being right. You have the numbers, and numbers cannot lie. Or can they? What does it even mean to be objective? And where do we get this data from anyway? Well, let's find out. So when we first look at the idea that facts don't care about our feelings, we first need to figure out what we mean by facts. If facts are this objective and flawless end-all be-all thing, then it's worth looking into where they actually come from. So like I mentioned earlier, most of our modern science is built on Enlightenment values. The scientific method was coming into being in the early days of the Enlightenment, and it was being used by scientists like Isaac Newton and Antony von Leeuwenhoek to discover new things and create inventions like modern microscopy and microbiology and calculus. I'm an English professor, and this is the second video in which I have brought up calculus. I think that I'm doing something very wrong with my life. These Enlightenment intellectuals pioneered new ways of asking questions and finding answers, and those methods are still being used by scientists today. We have these tried and true methods of discovering truths about our world. We have experiments and models and statistics. We have very particular sets of rules for how to perform observations and what kind of language to use in our reporting of our observations. This is all good. So what's wrong? I mean, we do science using good methodologies, so shouldn't that give us the right answers about the world around us? Well, we don't just go out and scream our statistical quandaries into the void until we're blessed with infinitely wise and perfectly impartial data from the heavens. Our stuff is made by people, and people are fallible and biased and just, like, gross. Now, I'm not saying that all statisticians and scientists are liars. They aren't, at least not most of them, but they are human, and humans have cognitive biases and feelings. Everywhere we go, everything we do, everything we experience is touched by human fallibility. Every single thing is filtered through our messy brains. Now, this isn't to say that we can never get facts or that facts don't exist. That is not what I'm arguing here. What I'm saying isn't that facts don't exist. I'm saying that our perception of facts is reliant on feelings. It's reliant on the assumptions and biases that we all carry within us. The bottom line is this. If you aren't an expert in your field, and you probably aren't, you don't know the facts. What you possess is knowledge of a subset of the facts, and how you decide what facts are included in that subset is of paramount importance. This filter is going to be determined by your background, your experiences, your social circle, your interests, and yes, by your feelings. How you feel about the political slant of news sources is going to determine which ones you prefer. How you feel about the underlying conclusion of research is going to determine what findings you emphasize and what findings you discard, as well as what research you even seek out. You can't separate the influence that your feelings have on the facts that you know. This is how you can give two people the same news article or have them watch the same debate and have them end up with two entirely different ideas of the outcome. They saw the same thing, they were presented with the same facts, but their feelings, the biases and assumptions that they started with, changed the way they perceived those facts. So when Ben Shapiro says that IQ differences between sexes and races is just basic science or just the facts, consider which facts Ben has chosen to value, which sources he reads, what assumptions he's starting with. And then consider the hundreds of articles by thousands of scientists and psychologists and sociologists and doctors that contradict what he's saying. Sources, facts, that he is choosing not to read because those facts don't fit with his feelings. Now I know that some of you may not be on board with this idea yet, and that's okay. So let's look at some examples. One thing that people think of as objective is photography. On the surface, it might seem like a photograph of something is an objective, neutral representation of that thing, right? But what about the lighting? The angle, the type of lens or the aperture or the shutter speed? And what about, say, maps? Even Google Maps and Google Earth don't give us perfectly objective, factual representations of the world around us. Many of the pictures are grainy or outdated. You might go to some city or even your home address just to see that buildings are missing. The housing complex you live in hasn't even been built yet. Your house doesn't exist according to the objective Google Maps. And sure, this is fine when the whole thing is theoretical or low stakes, like trying to find your house on Google Maps, but what about when it isn't? What about when people are using data to make real, substantial decisions, like where to send police patrols or which prisoners get parole? A lot of our penal system is starting to use modeling to help answer these questions because they believe that models, unlike the subjective opinions of judges and sheriffs, are neutral. So they hire mathematicians and statisticians to build them these models, programs that take old data, learn from it, and then use it to make new predictions. For instance, police use this software to decide where they should patrol. They plug crime data into the program, and then the program gives them a map showing where the most crimes will occur. And then the police send their officers to those areas. It just makes sense, right? But the thing about models is that they only output good information if you give them good information to start with. Are we sure that we're doing that? Our policing models are built on the question, where do most crimes occur? And they want to use that question to stop the biggest and the worst crimes from happening. But a large number of crimes are nuisance crimes, which are like small-scale, non-violent crimes like vagrancy and panhandling and small-time drug use. And these nuisance crimes are more prevalent in poorer neighborhoods. So the map that the model gives you is just going to highlight poor neighborhoods. Yeah, the data that is being output says that poor and Black and Hispanic neighborhoods are more likely to have more crimes, but your output is dependent on your input. If you have data for a bunch of crimes that are more prevalent in poor neighborhoods, and that is the data you feed the program, then the program is going to tell you poor neighborhoods are where the crime is happening. And then you send your officers to those neighborhoods, they catch more crimes simply because there are more people there to catch more crimes, which then justifies sending more officers there, and it's a vicious cycle. Bad input begets bad output. And this isn't just theoretical either. As mathematician and model maker Cathy O'Neil describes in her book Weapons of Math Destruction, Reading, Pennsylvania Police Chief William Heim had to figure out how to get the same or better policing out of a small force. So in 2013, he invested in crime prediction software made by Predpol. The program processed historical crime data and calculated hour by hour where crimes were most likely to occur. The Reading police force could view the program's conclusions as a series of squares, each one just the size of 2 football fields. If they spent more time patrolling these squares, there was a good chance they would discourage crime. And sure enough, a year later, burglaries were down by 23%. But this creates a pernicious feedback loop. The policing itself spawns new data, which justifies more policing in that area. So even if a model is quote-unquote colorblind, as Predpol's founder stresses that it is, saying that it doesn't focus on the individual and instead targets geography, the result is anything but. In our largely segregated cities, geography is a highly effective proxy for race. Predpol, even with the best of intentions, empowers police departments to zero in on the poor, stopping more of them, arresting a portion of those, and sending a subgroup to prison. And the police chiefs, in many cases, if not most, think that they're taking the only sensible route to combating crime. That's where it is, they say, pointing to the highlighted ghetto on the map. And now they have cutting-edge technology powered by big data, reinforcing their position there, while adding precision and science to the process. The result is that we criminalize poverty, believing all the while that our tools are not only scientific, but fair. No one believes that the model is discriminatory because it's numbers and data and math and modeling, and those are all seen as neutral and objective, but they aren't. To once again quote O'Neil, models, despite their reputation for impartiality, reflect goals and ideology. Our own values and desires influence our choices from the data we choose to collect to the questions we ask. Models are opinions embedded in mathematics. So, if facts are so squishy, then why do we still rely on them for so much stuff? Because, ever since the Enlightenment, we have idolized the rugged individualist, the scientist scholar, and we've put objectivity on a pedestal. We think that scientists are infallible. We think that numbers don't lie. We think that statistics are neutral. And again, I am not saying we should ignore all science and statistics and models because they are marred by human intervention. All hail our AI overlords. We should trust scientists. But we should also acknowledge the shortcomings of data. We need to see that data is dependent on feelings, because we can't move past something if we don't know that it's there. And we do need to move past it, because as it stands, the perceived objectivity of data is causing some pretty serious problems. You know how when you give someone bad news, you might say, oh, I'm just the messenger, or don't shoot the messenger? People do the same thing with data, especially politicians. As philosopher Stephen Gockrogger puts it, the reduction of things to raw numbers becomes a form of control that allows complete abdication of responsibility. The numbers speak for themselves. Politicians and bureaucrats are no longer responsible for the decisions made because all elements of personal judgment have been removed. In other words, when we think that numbers and stats are neutral and objective truths, we stop holding people responsible for things. I'm not saying it, that's just what the data says. Is a cop-out. Facts don't care about your feelings is just a smokescreen to duck into after you've said something controversial and you're too afraid of the backlash. So what is the alternative? How do we fix all of this? For one, we need to reevaluate what we think of objectivity. See, objectivity, at least the way that it's used in science, doesn't mean total neutrality and indifference. Thinking this is the case is part of why people are so eager to appeal to data and science. They see scientists as these inhumanly neutral entities. Objectivity is actually acknowledgement of your biases and assumptions and preferences, all the things that make you human, and then working past them. Ignoring them, or pretending that you don't have them, is a surefire way to fall prey to them. We need to stop putting neutrality on a pedestal. Stop thinking that scientists need to be aloof and unfeeling, because feelings are actually a very important part of the fact-finding process. As education scholar Sir Ken Robinson puts it, when all the statistics have been coded and calculated, the columns and data carefully set out on the computer screen, there is still a need to analyze and interpret them, to give them meaning. At the heart of all scientific undertakings, there is an element of personal judgment, which cannot be eradicated, nor should it be. The capacity for personal judgment is probably the most sensitive instrument a scientist has. So if you find someone who constantly brings up how objective or empirical or rational they're being, that should be a huge red flag. What you should look for instead is someone who acknowledges that they aren't objective, that they can't be, but that they see that and are working to move past it. Someone who says, hey, here's all my biases, let me lay them all out, and then we can work together to make sure that they aren't clouding my vision. That's what you should be looking for. We all have biases and assumptions and presuppositions and expectations and hopes and fears. We just need to be brave enough to face them. I want to close this section with a reading from Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man. This book is a masterpiece about science and racism in IQ testing, and Gould is, or I guess was, an incredible writer, and he is kind of my science hero, so I highly recommend it if you enjoyed any of what I talked about today. Impartiality, even if desirable, is unattainable by human beings with inevitable backgrounds, needs, beliefs, and desires. It is dangerous for a scholar even to imagine that he might attain complete neutrality, for then one stops being vigilant about personal preferences and their influences, and then one truly falls victim to the dictates of prejudice. Objectivity must be operationally defined as fair treatment of data, not absence of preference. No conceit could be worse than a belief in one's own intrinsic objectivity, no prescription more suited to the exposure of fools. The best form of objectivity lies in explicitly identifying preferences so that their influence can be recognized and countermanded. I criticize the myth that science itself is an objective enterprise, done properly only when scientists can shuck the constraints of their culture and view the world as it really is. I believe that science must be understood as a social phenomenon, a gutsy human enterprise, not the work of robots. So if science is squishy and bias is inevitable, then Ben Shapiro and the other intellectual dark web guys aren't actually using facts. They're using feelings. But their fans still listen to them and agree with them and are persuaded by them. Why? How are their facts so persuasive if they aren't actually facts? Why are there still people listening to them? People are still listening to them precisely because they aren't using facts. See, facts are dependent on ideology. Facts do actually care about your feelings, but your feelings, they don't actually care about facts. Stay tuned for my next video where I'm going